Naish is a lecturer in Ethnic and Gender Equality Studies at Doncaster Polytechnic. He's the author of the book Self-Empowerment for Racial Minorities in the Workplace, and he's active in the Society for the Politically Correct Modification of the English Language. Today his talk is called Why Manchester Should Be Renamed Personchester.
Dr. Darren Naish.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you very much for that introduction. Although I didn't get to hear it, what a shame. My name's Darren Naish. I'm a paleontologist based at the University of Portsmouth. You can also regard me as an academic.
Use the other mic, Darren.
Right. Yeah, hello? Okay, so yeah, you could regard me as an academic cryptozoologist. Richard's just left the room. You could regard me as someone who sits behind computers all day and waffles, which is what Richard said earlier. Brilliant, thanks Richard. So, the title of this talk today is The Deep Time History of Britain's Felid Fauna. And my aim in this talk is to give you an overview of the fossil and archaeological history, what you could call the deep time history of Europe's cats, concentrating in particular on the cats of the British Isles. We are not only going to be looking at species that are still with us today, but also at species that no longer occur within the region at all, and also at species that are now entirely extinct. And if you're here because you're predominantly interested in the British big cat phenomenon, you may be wondering what relevance does this have for the study of cats in Britain today. Maybe it is completely irrelevant. On the other hand, you could make the argument that we need to have a historical understanding of our native felids, especially if we want to employ the argument that we need to have a historical understanding if we're going to sensibly evaluate the role that cats should and do play in British ecology. Now, you probably know that lions, leopards and lynxes all inhabited Britain within geologically recent times. Hopefully, well, you may well know that we still had lynxes here as recently as the 6th century AD. But did you know that it's been suggested that African wildcats were once British natives? Did you know that pumas were once British natives? Did you know that swamp cats or jungle cats, same species, different names, did you know that swamp cats were once British natives? Did you know that jaguars were once British natives? Well, we're going to be looking at all of those details and others. We need to do two things before we start looking at the cats themselves, though. The first thing is that we need to look very briefly at the different geological time periods that I'll be referring to in the talk. The second thing is that we need to look very briefly at cat phylogeny, at cat evolutionary history, in order to get some perspective on how the different cat groups are related to one another. So we will begin with geological time. Now, for the purposes of this talk, we only need to concern ourselves with the two most recent geological periods, the Pleistocene and the Holocene. The Pleistocene is the period of time between 1.8 million years ago and 11,800 years ago. The Pleistocene is, of course, the time of the Great Ice Ages, when cold conditions in the northern hemisphere meant that much of North America and Eurasia were covered by ice sheets. Even southern England would have been as cold as modern Greenland. These cold glacial phases were punctuated by warm interglacial phases, where woodlands and grasslands were widespread across North America and Eurasia. During the interglacials, Europe would have been home to such animals as hippos, ostriches, giraffes. Numerous different names have been given to the different glacial and interglacial phases of the Pleistocene. We don't need to worry about any of those. But we will be referring to the division of the Pleistocene into an old, early Pleistocene and into a more recent middle and late Pleistocene. And it's the late Pleistocene that's of special interest to us. It extends between 130,000 and 11,800 years ago. As with the rest of the Pleistocene, the late Pleistocene was punctuated by both glacial and interglacial phases, and in fact some of the glacial phases of the late Pleistocene were the coldest and most severe of the entire Pleistocene. Britain's isolation from the rest of, from continental Europe began pretty late in the middle Pleistocene, around about 225,000 years ago. This is the wrong version of my presentation. I've saved the previous version, which is a shame, because I had some really good slides of the mega flood event that happened 225,000 years ago. During the Middle Pleistocene, there was a huge ice-dammed lake which built up in what's now the southern parts of the North Sea. And at 225,000 years ago, this lake burst through a chalk ridge known as the Weald Artois anticline, caused a massive mega flood event, scouring out a deep channel, which today we call the English Channel, of course. Following the Pleistocene, the last 11,800 years are known as the Holocene, and this is essentially the modern era. Glacial conditions no longer occurred. The flora and fauna of Europe was essentially modern, and big Ice Age mammals like mammoths and giant deer, they were still around, but they were now restricted to just a few small isolated pockets. Rising sea levels meant that the English Channel became much deeper, the North Sea flooded around about 9,000 years ago, so pretty early on in the Holocene, and by about 5,000 years ago, much of Western Europe, including the British Isles, had been strongly affected by the spread of farming and the removal of woodland. Okay, so that's the introduction to the geological history stuff. Moving now to cat phylogeny. Again, this isn't directly relevant to the talk, but it should it might help to get some current idea as to what present thinking is on cat evolution. Now, it's been argued for quite a long time that advanced cats, the so-called feline cats, don't group neatly into a big cat group and a small cat group. And various researchers argued during the 1980s and 1990s that some of the smaller cats, such as the marbled cat, the lynxes, the golden cats, it was argued that they might be more closely related to the big cats than they were to other small cats. And studies such as this one from 2004 continue to support this kind of idea. But the most recent large-scale genetic study of cats, it was published in 2006 by Warren Johnson and colleagues. This study actually did show that the true big cats, that's the Panthera species, the lion, the leopard, the tiger, jaguar and snow leopard, and the clouded leopard, they do indeed appear to be the most basal, the oldest clade within the feline clade. A clade is a group of organisms that shares a single ancestor. So it does seem, after all, that within the feline clade, there is an early dichotomy into a big cat clade and a clade that includes all the other cats, what you might call the smaller cats. And this smaller cat clade is itself broken down into 7 different clades, which in order of divergence from oldest to youngest are the bay cat clade, the caracal clade, the ocelot clade, lynx clade, puma clade, leopard cat clade, and domestic cat clade. And a few things that you might find particularly interesting, if you're into cats, is the caracal clade also includes the serval, so servals and caracals are close relatives. They are not part of the same clade as the lynxes. The golden cats don't form a clade. Some are members of the bay cat clade and some are members of the caracal clade. Pumas and cheetahs are close relatives. They're part of the puma clade, obviously. And whether they are close relatives of true big cats is controversial. Some studies support this idea and others refute it. Johnson and colleagues found pumas, cheetahs and jaguarundis to form a clade that was itself most closely related to the clade that includes the Asian leopard cat and relatives and the old world wild cats and domestic cats. Okay, so that is the background stuff. We're now going to start looking at the cats themselves, and we begin with a species which is pretty much definitely extinct. It's not even a member of the feline cat clade at all. It is in fact a saber-tooth, and is known as Homotherium latidens, sometimes called the scimitar-toothed cat or dirk-toothed cat. Several different species of Homotherium inhabited Africa, Eurasia and North America during the Pleistocene. The different species can be distinguished on the basis of body size, skull shape, the proportional length of their forelimbs and other features. And it has repeatedly been suggested that Homotherium latidens may have survived in Britain until as recently as 11,000 years ago, so that's early on in the Holocene. which is pretty amazing because all the other evidence in Europe shows that these cats went extinct around about 300,000 years ago. That's sometime during the Middle Pleistocene. This idea of late British survival for Homotherium all rests entirely on a single upper canine tooth, this tooth. It was found in Robin Hood Cave in Derbyshire in 1876. The problem with this tooth is that it has a hole drilled in it, and this indicates that it almost certainly was moved around by people. It was most likely worn on a necklace. And isotope studies of this tooth, published in 1980, showed that it differed in its chemical composition from all other British Homothere fossils. So these factors cast so much doubt on the authenticity of this find that it's no longer regarded as a valid British record of Homotherium, and it's even been suggested that the Robin Hood Cave tooth was planted in the same way as were the Piltdown man fossils in East Sussex. Having said all that though, we do now know from this lower jaw, dredged up from the bottom of the North Sea, we do know that Homotherium survived in Northern Europe until around about 30,000 years ago. So in other words, until late in the late Pleistocene. And what's really interesting about this jaw is that it's pretty similar in age to this famous statuette apparently depicting a Homotherium that comes from the Isteritz cave in southwest France. Now these records, the North Sea lower jaw and the Isteritz statuette, they probably don't represent the last records of Homotherium in Europe ever, so it's still pretty exciting to think that this giant saber-toothed cat did persist in Europe until late in the late Pleistocene, around about 30,000 years ago. Although so far as we can tell from fossils at the moment, it didn't make it into the Holocene. So in Europe, Homotherium may well not have made it into the Holocene after all. But another large, impressive cat definitely did, and this time it's a species that's still with us today, and this is the lion. Lions occurred throughout Europe, including Britain, during much of the Pleistocene, but especially during the Middle and Late Pleistocene. And conventionally, these European lions have been regarded as a type of lion, the so-called cave lion, which was distinct from modern lions. Cave lions have far stockier limbs than living lions. They have far broader skulls. They're also much larger than living lions, up to a third larger than the biggest living lions. And we know from cave art that male cave lions did not have large or luxuriant manes. It is generally agreed, not universally agreed, it is generally agreed among cat experts that cave lions weren't distinct enough, either in terms of anatomy or genetics, to warrant separate species status relative to the modern lion. So they're still regarded as part of the same species, Panthera leo. But genetic work has shown that the cave lions, they do represent an old lineage. They diverged from the modern lion lineage around about 600,000 years ago, so that's during the Middle Pleistocene. In contrast, the living lion populations of Asia and Africa, they diverged from one another much more recently, something like 200,000 years ago. And there are no strong genetic links between any of the modern lions and cave lions. Cave lions were a dead end. They did not give rise to any of the Asian lions or to any of the living lions of northern or eastern Africa, as has been suggested on a few occasions. Lions did survive until surprisingly recently in parts of Europe. They made it beyond the end of the Pleistocene and into the Holocene, in northern Spain, in Greece, in Italy, which isn't shown on this map, and also in, did I say Bulgaria? I can't remember. They were definitely still present in southeastern Europe as recently as the 10th century. And of course they survived in Asia Minor until the 19th and 20th century. Now, which of these lions were modern type lions and which of them were cave lions is actually still uncertain. The experts still haven't made a final decision on this, but it does seem likely that all of these younger lions, all of these Holocene lions, it seems that they were more closely related to Asian lions and North African lions, and they weren't late surviving cave lions, unfortunately. as a particularly large, often social cat that will prey on livestock given the opportunity. Lions were, of course, only able to survive within the European region in the wildest and most remote regions. Now, I think that everybody interested in cats knows that the leopard, although today restricted to Africa and Asia, was historically a European species. During most of the Pleistocene, leopards occurred throughout Europe, including in the British Isles. The fossil record indicates that leopards first appeared in Europe about 1 million years ago. After originating in Africa, they got out of Africa and invaded Eurasia at about the same time as members of our own species did the same thing. Young fossils of leopards are unknown from Britain, certainly for the last 15,000 years, and hence for the whole of the Holocene, we don't seem to have had, or leopards seem to have been absent from the British Isles. But the leopard did survive beyond the end of the Pleistocene and into the Holocene on the European mainland, and there are Holocene remains of leopards from Spain and Greece. In fact, exactly how recently leopards became extinct in Europe isn't entirely clear. Leopard bones from Italy and the Ukraine have been dated to the 1st century AD. They might indicate that leopards survived in those areas until pretty much modern times. And there are even leopards from Rome that have been dated to the 5th or 6th century, but they almost certainly represent animals that were imported for the Roman games. They weren't late surviving natives. Now, the leopard is a highly diverse species. It is probably the most diverse cat species in existence. It varies to an incredible degree in body size, ecology, coloration and patterning. An incredible 27 leopard subspecies have been named. And some of this naming of subspecies does reflect genuine variation within the species, but recent genetic work indicates that the 27 so-called subspecies are most realistically grouped into just 9, and these are the African leopard, South Arabian leopard, Persian leopard, the Indian leopard, the Sri Lankan leopard, the Javan leopard, the South Chinese leopard, the North Chinese leopard, and the Far Eastern or Amur leopard. One thing that I find both interesting and really frustrating about diverse so-called polytypic species like the leopard is that while there might be 9 subspecies, most of us only ever get to see images or specimens of 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 of these subspecies. Most of them are very poorly represented, not only in the literature, but also in zoological collections and on TV. We only really tend to see images or specimens of African leopards or Indian leopards, both of which are relatively short-haired, stocky, large-bodied leopards. Now, European Pleistocene leopards have, virtually without exception, been imagined to look like this. But given that some of the living leopard subspecies are far more diverse in appearance, sometimes varying quite markedly in appearance relative to the African and Indian leopards, is it possible that European Pleistocene leopards might also have looked quite distinct? What exactly might European Pleistocene leopards have looked like? And how were they related to the living leopard populations? Well, to answer these questions, we need to look at the phylogeny, that's the evolutionary history of the leopard subspecies. And thanks to a 2004 study by Olga Ufrokina and colleagues, we do have a reasonably good understanding of leopard evolution. Ufrokina and colleagues showed that the leopards of Africa seem to be the most primitive type of leopard, that the leopards of Western and Central Asia were more recently evolved and had evolved from those African ancestors, and that the youngest leopards were the ones from Northern and Eastern Asia. Those are the most recently evolved leopard clade. How do European Pleistocene leopards fit into all of this? Well, unfortunately, at the moment, we can't really answer this question because nobody's yet studied the DNA of fossil leopards to see how they compare to the living ones. However, it has been argued on the basis of anatomy that European Pleistocene leopards were essentially similar to the African ones after all, so maybe they did look like them. We do have one Pleistocene cave painting of a European leopard. It's that animal there underneath the spotted hyena. And it's interesting in that it shows the animal with this particularly prominent white belly. Most living leopards do not have this, they're spotted on the belly. So maybe European Pleistocene leopards would have looked distinctive to us. Let me emphasise that I'm basing all of this on one cave painting though, so it's extremely speculative. Now the leopard wasn't the only big spotted Panthera species that inhabited Europe during the Pleistocene. It was joined by a second, far less well-known cat, and this is the animal sometimes known as Panthera gombazogoensis. This species, this cat, was extremely jaguar-like. It's often known as the European jaguar, and in fact it probably is a jaguar after all. That is, it probably isn't a distinct species, it probably is part of the species known as Panthera onca, the jaguar, so its proper name should be Panthera onca gombazogoensis. The European jaguar makes its first appearance in the fossil record around about 1.5 million years ago. That's during the early Pleistocene, when it's known from Italy. It then persisted into the middle Pleistocene, at which time it's known from Germany, France, Spain, and also from England. And in fact, some of the best fossils we have of this subspecies, or species, whatever it is, come from Westbury in Somerset, and they were described in 1982 in this volume. I can't believe I saved the wrong copy of the presentation. There should be loads of additional slides in this. European jaguars and leopards lived alongside one another during much of the middle Pleistocene. In 2007, the remains of both species were reported from the same stratigraphic levels of both Germany and the Czech Republic. Dave, how long would it take to upload another version of the presentation?
Too long.
Takes about a minute, right?
Yeah.
Does anybody mind if I actually load a new version of the presentation?
Go for it.
Thanks.
Talk among yourselves, stretch your legs, whatever. Sorry.
What was the animal?
Slowly.
Which mic was it, the black one?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry about that. I gave this talk, I last gave this talk 2 years ago, and I've gone to a lot of trouble to update it, and there's nothing more annoying than then seeing that you're using the out-of-date stuff. Let me just quickly show you. You know, I said that's the Iceland Lake, right, which was located in the southern part of the North Sea. So 225,000 years ago, it breaks through the Weald Artois anticline. We get this massive flood event. Catastrophic things scoured out this massive deep channel. This is a really interesting discovery. It's nothing to do with cats, but it's neat anyway. So that was the formation of the English Channel 225,000 years ago. Yada, 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 yada. Went through all this, didn't we? Lions, yeah, a few additional records, leopards. And I got as far as jaguars, didn't I? Yeah, European jaguars. Right. I'm very sorry about that. Really apologise. Now, yes, right. So the last thing I was saying was that so the leopard wasn't the only big spotted cat. We have the jaguar as well, the European jaguar. I said that it occurred in various locations throughout Europe during the Middle Pleistocene. And I said that it lived at the same stratigraphic levels, its fossils were present in the same stratigraphic levels as the leopard in some places. See, that's a new slide. We might think of the idea of the jaguar being a European species as quite peculiar. Obviously, we think of this cat today as an animal of tropical South America, to a lesser extent one of Central America, and also one that occurs within the southern parts of the USA. But this present distribution is entirely an artifact. Historically, jaguars were old world cats. They originated in Africa or Eurasia from a leopard-like ancestor. They later moved across Eastern Asia and Beringia into the Americas. Jaguars didn't survive as recently as leopards did in Europe. They don't seem to have made it into the late Pleistocene or the Holocene. Okay, now most people know, as I mentioned, most people know that lions and leopards were present in Europe during the Pleistocene. Hopefully everybody knows that lynxes live in Europe. Extremely poorly known, however, is the fact that Europe was also inhabited by, by pumas. Pumas today are, of course, exclusively American, but a European fossil cat has now been described as a European puma. And this cat has a really confusing history. It was originally described in 1846 as Felis pardoides. This was later changed to Panthera pardoides. It was sometimes known as Owen's cat because it was named and described by the famous Victorian anatomist Sir Richard Owen, who I'm sure you all know. In 1954, another new Pleistocene cat was described from France, and it was called it was named Panthera schaubii, Schaub's panther. But a reanalysis of Schaub's panther published in 1965 showed that it wasn't a member of the genus Panthera at all. That is, it wasn't a close relative of lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, and snow leopards. It was in fact far more unusual, and in fact it was suggested to be rather puma-like, and it was thought to be deserving of its own new genus. So the new name Viritularis was now coined for Schaub's panther. The most recent analysis of Schaub's panther, published in 2004 by Helmut Hemmer and colleagues, has shown that Viritularis isn't just puma-like. In fact, it is a puma after all. It is actually a true puma. And what's more, it's the same thing as Panthera pardoides. So Owen's panther and Schaub's panther, they're the same thing. The name Viritularis is synonymous with puma, so Viritularis actually falls into the synonymy of puma. So the correct name for this old world puma is Puma pardoides. This is the kind of taxonomic trivia that many zoologists and paleontologists have to deal with on a regular basis. We don't like it, but we don't really hate it. Now, Owen's panther was often described as leopard-like. In fact, it was being referred to as leopard-like as recently as the 1980s. But now that we know that Puma podoides, as it's known now, now that we know that Puma podoides was obviously puma-like, well, what did it look like? Well, it does seem to have been very similar to modern pumas. The modern pumas are, of course, the American pumas, Puma concolor, and certainly the short-faced skull of Puma podoides is very similar to that of the extant living American Puma, Puma concolor. Now, Puma podoides isn't only known from the isn't only known from Europe, it's also known from the Transcaucasian region of Central Europe, it's also known from Mongolia, it's also known from Africa. So this animal is tremendously widespread. In Europe, it's known from France, Germany, Spain, and also from this country. It's known from Newbourne in Suffolk. And exactly how this species fits into the origin, the biogeographical history of the American puma is an interesting and complicated question that I don't really have time to go into. I've actually cut that section out of my talk. Now, as I'm sure you know, pumas are, well, as you might know rather, pumas are closely related to cheetahs. And it might not surprise you to know that cheetahs were also present in Pleistocene Europe as well. During the early and middle Pleistocene, there was a giant cheetah. It's called Achinopsis pardonensis. It was about 50% larger than the largest living cheetahs. And its fossils are known from France and Germany. It's also known from China and India. But unfortunately, we don't have any British fossils of this animal. Like the European jaguar, it doesn't seem to have survived into the late Pleistocene or to the Holocene, or into the Holocene. Moving now away from some of the larger cats, we start with lynxes. Lynxes are unmistakable. They are proportionally very long limbs. They have this really bizarre short little tail, they have a facial ruff, tufted ears, and they have quite a reduced dentition compared to most other cats. 3 lynxes inhabited Europe during the Pleistocene, and 2 of those are still with us. The Eurasian lynx, or northern lynx, lynx, and the much smaller Iberian lynx, Lynx pardinus. The third species was rather different from these 2. It's known as Lynx isidorensis, the Issois or Isidore lynx, and it had far stockier limbs and proportionally a much bigger head than living lynxes. In fact, in its proportions, it was something like a pantherine cat, like a leopard, and these proportions, combined with its relatively large size, mean that its remains have sometimes been confused with those of European pumas and cheetahs. The Issois lynx didn't survive into the Holocene, so far as we know, but of course the other 2 European lynxes did. European lynxes during the Pleistocene occurred throughout most of Central Europe, but of course today they're restricted to the Iberian Peninsula. They are critically endangered, with a highly fragmented population consisting of between just 300 and 500 individuals. These little black areas show the current breeding range of the Iberian lynx. Eurasian lynxes colonised the whole of Eurasia, or virtually the whole of Eurasia, during the Pleistocene, but persecution, habitat loss and hunting have meant that within modern times they've become restricted to just a few of the more remote regions. Across most of Western Europe, including the British Isles, they are effectively extinct. In Britain, the Eurasian lynx has conventionally been regarded as a Pleistocene animal that failed to make it into the Holocene. But we now know this is completely wrong. Eurasian lynxes were definitely still present in England and in southern Ireland until as recently as about 9,000 years ago. So that's early on in the Holocene. The English records, one of which comes from Derbyshire, the other one comes from Devon, they've been carbon dated, providing dates of between 8,900 and 9,500 years ago. And that's all pretty good. It shows that lynxes were still here in the Holocene. However, in 1997 came the really surprising news that lynxes survived in Scotland until the 3rd century. A lynx specimen discovered in 1927 in Reindeer Cave in Sutherland. This was carbon dated, providing a date of 1,770 years old. Further radiocarbon dating of lynxes from North Yorkshire these were published in 2006. They provided even younger ages of about 1,550 years old, dating these specimens to the 5th or 6th century. In their paper on these modern era lynxes, David Hetherington and colleagues noted that a word for lynx, lewin, is supposed to be pronounced with a th at the front, fluin or something. This word was being used for lynxes as recently as the 7th century in various stories and lullabies, all of which did originate from the kind of region northwest England, roughly the same area where the 5th and 6th century lynx specimens came from. And we actually know from pollen data that this region was still reasonably well forested at the time, so it still seems as if it was good lynx habitat. So this indicates that lynxes did survive in northwest England until at least the 7th century, and it's possible and likely that they may have survived even more recently than this. In fact, quite why lynxes became extinct in Britain, especially when they survived in Scandinavia and elsewhere in Northern Europe, is open to speculation. It is assumed that deforestation, hunting and persecution did the lynx in. Is it conceivable that lynxes survived from the 5th, 6th or 7th centuries until the present? Well, various zoologists of the past, including Bernard Hoovermans and H.G. Hurrell and others, have suggested exactly this. And of course we have pretty good historical accounts, such as William Cobbett's account from the late 1700s, that do seem to describe late surviving British lynxes. Given the massive impact that humans have had on Britain's mammal fauna within the last couple of hundred years, I personally think the idea that any mid-sized or large mammal might have survived undetected is very unlikely, if not impossible. But if you had asked an expert 20 years ago whether they would regard the survival of lynxes to even the 5th century as likely, I think you'd have been laughed at. So perhaps we should be prepared to be surprised again. Okay, finally we come to the smaller cats. Conventionally, it's been thought that within recent history, the British Isles have only ever been home to a single cat species. And this is Felis sylvestris, the animal most often known as the Scottish wildcat. Of course, this name is completely inappropriate, given that the current restriction of the wildcat to Scotland is entirely an artefact of human persecution. Until recently, the wildcat, you might like to call it the forest wildcat instead of the Scottish wildcat, this animal occurred across the whole of Ireland, yes, Ireland, Wales and England as well as Scotland. Human persecution and habitat destruction meant that by 1800 the wildcat was gone from much of, well, virtually the whole of central and southern England. By 1850 it was gone from England entirely, and by the late 1800s it was essentially restricted to the Scottish Highlands. And this historical pattern of decline, this was worked out by Peter Langley and Derek Yalden in 1977. But as you all know, if you've read The Smaller Mystery Carnivores of the West Country by John Downes, there are enough sightings of wildcats from the 1800s and 1900s to suggest either that wildcats didn't become entirely extinct outside of Scotland, or that they managed to re-invade parts of the country from a Scottish centre of origin, or that people have actually been reintroducing them from Scotland to various parts of southern Britain. Now, wildcats do, of course, interbreed with domestic cats whenever the two meet. And this, of course, means that purebred wildcats are very rare, if not critically endangered, and This is a problem that's not just restricted to Britain, it affects wildcats on the European continent as well. Where wildcats have interbred with domestic cats, the wildcat characteristics continue to crop up in the hybrids. So you end up with a kind of what we call an introgressive continuum, where these hybrids can backcross with the wildcat ancestor and also with the domestic cat as well. You end up with a range of intermediates, a confusing mix of characteristics, making it very difficult sometimes to tell true wildcats apart from their hybrids. And it is generally thought that the mysterious black cats from Scotland, known as the Kellis cats, it is generally thought that that they owe their origins to complex hybridization of this sort. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was thought conventionally that the wildcat was the only small felid that ever inhabited the British Isles within geologically recent times. Well, this idea was challenged in 1997 when a fossil swamp cat, or jungle cat, same species, different name, this was discovered at Aveley in Essex. In sediments dated to around about 200,000 years ago, so in other words until the Middle Pleistocene. Unfortunately, we only have this one record to go on at the moment, so we essentially know nothing about the distribution of the swamp cat in Britain, both in terms of geographical distribution and also in terms of how recently it went extinct. And in fact, pretty similar comments can be made about the distribution of the swamp cat in Europe as a whole. There are some Pleistocene fossils of this species, but most of the European fossils of the swamp cat come from the Middle East. The absence of the swamp cat from Holocene sediments perhaps suggests that it didn't survive until particularly recently, but as with the lynxes that we just looked at a moment ago, evidence either way is really thin on the ground, and basically we need more data. And if you are wondering why the presence of swamp cats or jungle cats in Britain is such a big deal, why the presence of fossil swamp cats is such a big deal, it's because we know that we have them in the country now. People occasionally kill or obtain dead swamp cats in various parts of Britain, and these almost certainly represent escapees from captivity, but we do have to at least consider the possibility of native status, however remote it might be. Now, also very poorly known is the suggestion that African wildcats once occurred within the British Isles as well. In 1905, Robert F. Scharf described some lower jaws from Ireland and identified them as belonging to a cat particularly close to Felis libica or Felis sylvestris libica, whichever name you want to go for. That is the African wildcat. Based on bones discovered in Newhall and Edenvale caves in County Clare, Scharf thought that there were two Irish wildcats, a large one and a small one. And Scharf's identification has been repeated a couple of times since, the implication being that maybe Ireland was home to an endemic wildcat, perhaps one that was quite distinct from the wildcats of Scotland, Wales and England. But of course the problem here is that the bones and teeth of African wildcats are extremely similar, if not essentially identical, to the bones and teeth of domestic cats. And in fact, as you may well know, the domestic cat descends from the African wildcat rather than from the wildcats of Europe, and it can be virtually impossible to distinguish the two, at least not without large sample sizes and complex morphometric analyses and various other techniques. The Irish wildcats that Scharf described, they didn't come from a prehistoric fauna. They were actually discovered in layers where domestic mammals were abundant, and in an evaluation of Scharf's wildcats that was published in 1965, A.W. Stelfox concluded that they were domestic cats after all. The large ones were males and the small ones were females. Additional small cat species might have been present in Pleistocene Europe. There are some controversial German fossils that might represent Pallas's cats, but there's presently no evidence that additional species occurred within Britain. Two alleged species are notable for their absence from the fossil and archaeological record. There are no records whatsoever of the so-called rabbit-headed cats, and this suggests that so-called rabbit-headed cats are indeed peculiar hybrids or mutant domestic cats, as has been argued by a few zoologists. There are also no records at all of anything that might correspond to the hypothetical endemic British big cats thought to exist by Di Francis. And that does, at that point, we come to the end of this review of Europe's cat fauna. What have we learnt? Well, we've seen that the big saber-toothed cat, Homotherium latidens, we've seen that it was still present in northern Europe during the late Pleistocene, but it almost certainly didn't persist into the Holocene. It didn't persist into the last 11,800 years. Lions remained in Spain, Italy and southeastern Europe until the early Holocene, and of course they hung on around Asia Minor until modern times. Leopards inhabited Britain and the rest of Europe during much of the Pleistocene, but by the late Pleistocene they were gone from northern Europe, although they may have hung on around the Mediterranean and Asia Minor until as recently as the 1st century AD. The jaguar lived alongside the leopard in several locations during the middle Pleistocene, but didn't make it into the late Pleistocene. Pumas and cheetahs occurred across Europe and Asia during the early and middle Pleistocene. Pumas were present in Britain, but neither pumas nor cheetahs made it into the late Pleistocene or the Holocene. Lynxes definitely survived in Britain until the 1st century AD. They may well have persisted until the 6th or 7th centuries, and perhaps even more recently than this. Swamp cats were present in Britain during the middle Pleistocene, but there is as yet no evidence that they made it anywhere near the Holocene or into the Holocene, and there is no evidence that African wildcats were present in Ireland, despite suggestions from the early 1900s that they were. And of course, European wildcats, like this Scottish animal here, they were here throughout the Pleistocene and Holocene, and of course they've just about managed to survive until today. So Europe's cat fauna and Britain's cat fauna was obviously a lot more diverse in the recent past than it is today. And in fact, we have a really impoverished fauna compared to what we should have. And how we apply this knowledge in view of the assemblage of species that we have here now is a really interesting question. And it is on that point that I will say I apologise again for mucking around with the different versions. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much. Thank you.